out sniffing clues again. Hey guys, so it's week 2 of Sherlocktober, and I'm outside walking Skippy, so I thought I'd go ahead and talk about the first story we read for this week. I'm a little bundled up because it's only like 38 degrees out here. Welcome to fall. Anyway, the first short story is The Adventures of the Silver Blaze, which is a story of a stolen racehorse called Silver Blaze. It's a black horse. It's got a white star kind of marking on its face, rather distinctive. And also the murder of the trainer of the horse. And this is a pretty interesting story. It seems a bit different in the way Holmes solves it. In the past, he's mentioned to Watson, when Watson's asked him, "What do you think's happened?" And he says it's wrong to try and suppose things. He needs more facts, more data to come to a conclusion. But in this one, he uses something which he says the inspector in the case is lacking: his imagination. He supposes what may have happened and then acts upon that supposition till he proves it. And so as he's going towards the location of the crime, he's already learned some things from the paper as to the events that have happened, and he's already got a kind of an idea of what may have happened, and hence he finds things when he gets there. He goes to the scene of the crime, he's digging through the mud, and he unearths some clues that the inspector failed to find. He says, well, the reason you failed to find it, and that he did, is because he was looking for it. He expected something to be there. So it's just a little bit different twist on the way he ends up solving this crime, which I found rather interesting. Another part that I really liked is that you hear that one famous phrase, is the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. They say, but the dog did nothing in the nighttime. That's the curious incident. Colonel Ross is the owner of the horse, and he's glad of Holmes coming to investigate, even though he says he thinks the inspector's done all he can. The interesting thing about this is when I watched the TV version of this, the colonel, although he is also grateful of Holmes arriving, he doesn't think that an amateur detective will be able to find out much that the inspector hasn't already. And I liked Holmes's reaction to it when he hears this. You see the look on his face as he's listening to himself being described as an amateur detective, and he just kind of goes, "Ha!" You know, he just kind of just delighted at the humor of it that he finds in it. But yeah, it was a really, really great adaptation of it once again too. And I think maybe because of the way the colonel feels towards Holmes as being amateur, depicts the way he reveals what he knows, the way he comes to the conclusion and solves the case of this missing horse that no one seems to be able to find, even though it's got very distinctive marks, and the way he solves the murder and everything too. He kind of springs it on the colonel, that things have been, you know, right in front of you the whole time. It was just a really great episode. The mystery of the cardboard box is one in which Holmes tells Watson it's a case where he has to work backwards from effects to cause. And the effects in this case being 2 severed ears delivered in a cardboard box to a young woman by the name of Miss Cushing. She has no understanding as to why these particular items, gruesome as they are, were sent to her. She's had no arguments with anybody. She thinks, and so does Holmes, that it's a case of mistaken identity, and they were sent to the wrong person. Holmes studies the ears, and it's understandable that he could see clearly that there are 2 different victims here because of the differences between the ears. But the fact that he comes to the conclusion that one is a woman and one is a man, I find hard to understand. The case just seemed very rushed to me, solved a little too quickly. There's one point where he is interviewing someone, and he's looking at them closely and kind of studying the shape of their ear, and quickly comes to the conclusion that this person is related somehow to one of the victims because of the pattern of the ear. It's not like he has the ear in front of him to memorize what it looked like and to look at that person. And I don't know, that just seemed a bit kind of far-fetched. The whole case seemed a bit rushed. It wasn't particularly one of my favorites. So I just finished watching A Cardboard Box on DVD, I didn't really like the short story all that much, and in terms of the adaptation of it, I think I probably liked it even less. The short story didn't seem to have a whole lot to it, and it seemed like they tried to flesh out the story more, make more of it. There was a whole kind of beginning part to it. It seemed like there were almost two mysteries going on at the same time. I just overall did not like the way they adapted it, so a bit disappointed in this one. In The Crooked Man, we have Holmes investigating the death of a colonel in which the wife is the main suspect. The two were heard arguing by their household staff, in which she's calling him a coward, you betrayed him, and the name David pops up, although that is not the colonel's name. And then a sudden scream, and the staff can't get into the door because it's locked. So one of them goes around to the back side, outside of the house to the French doors, finding them wide open, and inside discovering the colonel dead, with his head kind of bashed in, and the wife fainted away on the floor. Her being the only one in the room, she seems to be the main suspect. The weird thing is that the key to the door is missing and is not found on either one of the people or anywhere in the room or anywhere in the house. So Holmes suspects that a third person was involved. So that is the main mystery. It's a murder mystery to be solved, and whether or not the wife is involved. The interesting thing about this particular story, most of the story takes place with Holmes relaying the facts to Watson. He's already been investigating this and looked into it, and he's kind of filling him in, and then the two kind of go off on the investigation. Which is a bit different. Usually Watson seems to be there right at the beginning through most of the interviews and things like that, but a lot of the story has already taken place, and Holmes is at a bit of a loss and finding that he has to kind of restart the investigation because he's kind of reached a dead end, and in a way he's hoping maybe even Watson might be able to help him out, which is a bit odd, but because of the nature of it and some of the background of some of the characters and soldiers having served in India, where Watson himself had served as a doctor, he thinks maybe he'll be able to give him some insight on it. But it's a little bit different. And when I watched the televised version of it, it was completely different. Whereas in the book, Holmes brings Watson into the investigation. It's completely the opposite way around in the televised version. We have Watson having served in a regiment in India and hearing of this murder of a colonel and the possibility that the wife is involved. And of course the army, wanting to keep that kind of under wraps from the public, he gets Holmes involved in the case. And I love Jeremy Brett's reaction to the character as he's kind of arriving. Like, he's fed up. He's like, give me the facts. He hasn't heard any of the facts or the details yet, That's all he wants. And you see Watson kind of cringe at the way Holmes is so abrupt with him and everything. But so it was a little slightly different interpretation of the storyline, but the major part of it and the underlying mysterious character of this crooked man, which you find out through the progression of the story, was really interesting. And I really liked that particular story. And also the actor they had that played it in the TV show was fantastic. Really, really good interpretation of that character. The only thing I didn't like within the story was the name David and the explanation as to who that name belonged to. This is the name that the colonel's wife shouted out while the two were having an argument. And when you find out the explanation for it at the end, I mean, it was just definitely a red herring to kind of throw a reader off. Holmes kind of explains it in the end, but I don't know, I just didn't really care for that part of the story. I mean, it was pretty far out there that the average reader wasn't going to pick up on that whatsoever. So I just finished The Greek Interpreter, and this was a really interesting story for two reasons. You learn a little bit more about Holmes's character. The story begins with this passage here. It says, "During my long and intimate acquaintance with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I had never heard him refer to his relations, and hardly ever to his own early life. This reticence upon his part had increased with the somewhat inhuman effect which he produced upon me, until sometimes I found myself regarding him as an isolated phenomenon, a brain without a heart, as efficient in human sympathy as he was preeminent in intelligence. His aversion to women and his disinclination to form new friendships were both typical of his unemotional character, but not more so than his complete suppression of every reference to his own people." The second reason that the story is interesting is we do meet one of his relations finally. We meet his brother Mycroft Holmes. We come to find out that he is 7 years older than Holmes, and Holmes refers to him as being even more superior in his observational skills. One of the things I really enjoyed was seeing Sherlock and Mycroft kind of going head to head in their observational skills. When they first show up at the Diogenes Club, where Mycroft is a member, and he introduces Watson to them, Mycroft is already looking out the window, waves his brother on, and he's like, you know, he starts talking about the people he sees, and the one person saying one thing, and oh, I see this, and oh, I see that, and it was just kind of a neat rivalry to witness. This particular story is about a Greek interpreter who happens to know Mycroft, and he brings this case to his attention, who then turns it over to Holmes, his brother Sherlock. So this Greek interpreter, he's brought to a home. He doesn't know where the location is, where he sees a man who has apparently been tortured, starved. He's got bandages all over him, and all he speaks is Greek. So they want him asking questions and want him to sign some papers. During this interview, a woman comes into the room unaware of what's going on until she happens to see this gentleman, and there's obvious connection that he comes to realize that they're brother and sister, and then shortly after he's hustled away, warned not to say anything, but he feels compelled to do something that he can to save this man. I felt the conclusion was kind of odd. It wasn't one that he necessarily nabs the criminal, but the story kind of, it concludes itself off the page. We just kind of come to find out what has happened after, but not necessarily through Holmes's direct involvement. But overall, I really enjoyed the story, and again, the adaptation of it was really, really good. The Naval Treaty was quite a long short story. It's almost double the length of most of the ones that I've read so far. This is another case that's brought to Holmes through Watson. An old schoolfellow of Watson's by the name of Percy writes to him asking for help. He's desperate. He hopes that he will be able to bring along Holmes to help solve this mystery that he finds himself in. Percy's a very nervous fellow because of some important papers that he was in charge of had gone missing, and he's to blame for them. He has a bit of a mental breakdown. When he does finally recover enough, he does write to Watson, and Watson explains what he knows to Holmes, and they go off to meet with Percy and find out more of the facts. Percy was given these important documents to make a copy of, and he was supposed to keep them locked in his office and give them back to his commander, or whoever was in charge, the next day. He steps away for a moment. The office is pretty much deserted except for some people that kind of take care of the place. Commissioner down below, he rings for coffee, but the guy doesn't answer, so he goes down to see what's taking the coffee so long. And while he's down there talking to him, they hear another bell ring, a bell from his room where there should be nobody. And by the time they race back up there, the papers have gone. So who rang the bell? Would the criminal be so brazen to say, hey, I'm here, you know, and ring the bell, try and catch me? So that's like one of the strange facts going on here. And that was a pretty good short story overall. The part like at the end when Holmes kind of explains things, he does state that there being too much evidence. He says what was vital was overlaid and hidden by what was irrelevant. Of all the facts which were presented to us, we had to pick just those which we deemed to be essential and then piece them together in their order so as to reconstruct this very remarkable chain of events. So yeah, in this case, sometimes there's not enough clues to figure out what's going on, and he has to use his imagination a little bit, or kind of see what's there and kind of work backwards from cause, cause to effects. And in this case, he has to peel away the extraneous like an onion until you get to the center of what's real. So overall, it was a really good short story. The Adventures of the Final Problem is a very unique story in the fact that there is no actual crime for Holmes to solve. There's no clues for him to look for. It's sort of a fencing game, thrust and parry. It's him against his arch nemesis, the master criminal, or the Napoleon of crime, as he refers to him, and that is Professor Moriarty. This is a character who only appears in two stories, The Final Problem and then the novel The Valley of the Fear, which is set at a time prior to The Final Problem. He's mentioned a couple other times in some of the other stories, but doesn't actually make a physical appearance. He's apparently responsible for many crimes that Holmes has dealt with, working in the background. He's never at the forefront. When people are caught, it's usually members of his gang, never Moriarty. This is the first time Watson's ever even heard of Moriarty. Holmes has never really mentioned him before. He starts talking about his intellect. He's a mathematical genius, on the same equivalent intellectually as Holmes, but he turned to a life of crime. And there's a point where he shows up, Moriarty shows up at 221B Baker Street, and they have the most excellent kind of repartee between, with the dialogue. It was actually fantastic. With an air of civility, but a hint of like, you know, I'm gonna catch you, or no, you're not, you can't catch me kind of thing going on. I'll read some of the dialogue. It was just fantastic. For Moriarty, it says, well, it seems a pity, but I have done what I could. I know every move of your game. You could do nothing before Monday. This is when Holmes thinks he'll be able to catch everybody. It has been a duel between you and me, Mr. Holmes. You hope to place me in the dock. I tell you that I will never stand in the dock. You hope to beat me. I tell you, you will never beat me. If you are clever enough to bring destruction upon me, rest assured that I shall do as much to you. And Holmes responds, you have paid me several compliments, Mr. Moriarty. He doesn't call him Professor. I love it. Said I. He says, let me pay you one in return when I say that if I were assured of the former eventuality, I would, in the interest of the public, cheerfully accept the latter, meaning he would sacrifice his life if it meant he could finally bring this guy to justice. It begins, of course, being written by Watson, penning this particular story some 2 years after the events, and it begins like this. It is with a heavy heart that I take up my pen to write these, the last words in which I shall ever record the singular gifts by which my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes was distinguished. Later on it says, it lies with me to tell for the first time what really took place between Professor Moriarty and Mr. Sherlock Holmes. This is a story that Doyle wrote in a way because he was tired of writing Sherlock Holmes stories. And the only way he could kind of put an end to it was to kill off his main character. So it comes to a final battle of wills between Moriarty and Holmes. We know that within a few days' time, Holmes hopes to catch the entire gang and Moriarty up in his nets. But in the meantime, his life is in danger, and he gets Watson to kind of come along with him, and they travel to the continent to kind of get away from the area. But unbeknownst to them, or well, suspecting you might say, Moriarty's on their trail. He does succeed in kind of getting the gang arrested, but Moriarty slips through the cracks and ends up meeting them at the end. I saw the Granada television version of this too. Absolutely fantastic. And that scene in Baker Street with the two was just fantastic. This is a great story. Also a very sad story, with the outcome being the supposed death of both Moriarty and Holmes. They have a struggle at the top of Reichenbach Falls, and Watson, having been lured away momentarily, returns only to see a walking stick from Holmes and a note left behind, which Moriarty gave him the opportunity to leave for Watson before their ultimate battle. It's sort of in a way left open-ended. I mean, the fact that, you know, there are no bodies to be found, it'd be difficult to even look for them at the bottom of this massive fall. So as far as the public knew, reading upon this, they just figure Holmes is dead, and that is the end of it. But yeah, if you get a chance, that is just a fantastic story, but I would really watch it on the Jeremy Brett version of it, if you could track it down. Yeah, so that concludes week 2 of Sherlocktober. Week 3 we'll be reading The Hound of the Baskervilles, and it's been quite some time since I read that, so I'm looking forward to kind of returning to it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the second vlog, and I gotta get caught up on so much reading. I got Victober to do too, so I gotta go. Bye.